All right, I'm Mr. Justice, and we're going to talk about Intro to Biodiversity. Let's get started. We can categorize biodiversity in three different levels: ecosystem diversity, species diversity, and genetic diversity. Take a look up here, right? The higher the diversity or the biodiversity in an area, the higher the ecosystem health. Look at the diversity of the ecosystems found within just this picture alone. I'm looking here at a desert. I'm looking at some shrublands. I'm looking at an ecosystem that is a forest, right? Think of all of the organisms that would live within each of these ecosystems too. They are uniquely suited and adapted to being able to live within their desert biome or their forest biome. Or take a look here, right? There's a marine or an aquatic ecosystem with salt water in it, just as there is a freshwater river right here, right? So all of these ecosystems each have features, climate patterns, precipitation patterns that really determine the composition of the organisms found within, and each of those organisms are uniquely adapted and suited to live within those ecosystems. So the higher the larger the ecosystem diversity within an area, the more healthy it is. We can also define biodiversity at the species level too. Take a look at the image here of all of the different consumers and producers and decomposers found within this ecosystem. The higher the species diversity, the higher the ecosystem health as a result. Hey, we can also say that the genetic diversity is a level of biodiversity that we can be interested in, right? Each of these individuals here is slightly different in their genome, right? Small changes to the mutations, the DNA, or to the crossing over event that happens in the reproductive stage or cells is also going to determine and give us genetic diversity, right? The higher the genetic diversity between the area, the healthier the ecosystem as a result. Take a look here, right? Wetlands are very different than savannas because wetlands have water available, liquid water available the entire year, whereas a savanna is going to have a rainy season that determines its producers, right? And if we take a look at this in the wetlands, will be warmer throughout the entire year too, right? Think of where the energy comes from in a fast-moving river, like what you're seeing in the lower left-hand corner. A fast-moving river will not allow rooted plants to be able to take root and grow there. So a lot of the energy is going to come then from either upriver or from dead leaves and biomass that will fall into this river. And because of that, we're going to have a completely different composition of organisms found within each one of these individual ecosystems. As a result, right? Hey, let's look at the species over here, right? Counting 1, 2, 3, 4. The wetlands, based on this one picture here, has a species richness of 4 because there's 4 different species listed on my image right here, right? And then take a look here, these frogs. We can also say, well, gosh, frogs are going to differ in their DNA sequences. And those differing DNA sequences might impart disease resistance or might make some of the frogs larger or smaller. Some of the frogs might be able to adapt to climatic changes like an increase in temperature or an increase in salt levels in water compared to others, right? And those abilities to adapt come from the DNA, the genome of the individuals within those species. All right. Let's talk about ecosystem diversity. This is the number and variety of ecosystems or habitats within a specified area. Ecosystem diversity increases the overall biodiversity. The greater the biodiversity, the greater the ecosystem diversity as a result, and the healthier the area is. Here in the Las Vegas Valley, we've got, just minutes, 45 miles or so apart is a freshwater man-made or human-made reservoir that will house the plants and the animals within this ecosystem, but also along the banks too, right? I'm thinking of the bighorn sheep. And about 45 miles west of that area is now we're in the mountains, right? The forest ecosystem and all the organisms that would live there. And then in between is the Mojave Desert, right, with all of the plants and the animals and consumers that live there that are uniquely adapted to living within that specific area too. It's all determined by temperature patterns throughout the year and precipitation. Let's talk about species diversity. Here's a big concept that we've got to understand for these set of notes. We'll talk about today species richness and evenness. Now, species richness is referring to the total number of species found in an ecosystem, whereas evenness is a measure of how all of the individual organisms in an ecosystem are balanced between the different species. And there's a good key word for us right there, balanced, right? Hey, evenness indicates that if there are one or two dominant species, or it's going to tell us whether or not a population size is well balanced. What does this mean? Let's take a look at a picture here, right? I'm looking at two different communities here. If you count up, actually, let's do it real quick. I see, let's count up the number of species. Let's figure out the species richness. I see this type of species. I see this one, and this one. There's 4. There's a species richness of 4 in community 1. Let's take a look at community 2. 1, 2, 3, 4. Community 1 and 2 both have the same species richness, a value of 4. But it's not enough to be able to determine if an area is more biodiverse versus the other using just that richness number, right? If the richness numbers were different, the higher the richness number, the more biodiverse. But if they're the same, we'd have to look at some other factors. And this is the evenness. This is where that comes in. Take a look here. If you look at the composition of all of the trees in community 1, it looks pretty even, right? There's 4 of the pine trees, and then there's actually 4 of each of these individuals. 4 out of 16 is 25%. So look at the composition here. The proportions all across the board of each species is 25%. So community 1 then is highly even. It has high evenness. Community 2, if you look at the proportions down here, 70% of the species in community 2 are being dominated by this kind of lighter green colored tree. Likewise, all of the other ones are out of balance. And so that's what we're talking about here with balance, right? Hey, one is dominating the community, and so it's highly uneven or out of balance as a result. Look at this example here, right? Two communities. Think to yourself for a minute, what's the species richness? The species richness is 6 for both community 1 and for community 2. So even though both communities have the same species richness, they're different in their evenness. And if you look at just the composition of community 2 alone, it looks a lot more even. It's got high evenness compared to community 1 that's being dominated by one specific type of species. We can talk about genetic diversity and biodiversity at that level too. Differences in the genetic makeup we're talking about when we talk about genetic diversity, we're discussing about the differences in the genetic makeup, the DNA among individuals of a species. Those genetic differences are the result of mutations or crossing over events that happen in the reproductive cells of the parents. So those differences are going to impart, traits, right? Traits that are able to hopefully maintain reproductive vitality or maybe impart disease resistance or give the organism a greater ability to adapt to climatic conditions. So more genetic diversity within a population tends to increase their ability to endure environmental change. Imagine, climate change is increasing the sea temperatures of the ocean. If coral are unable to withstand and tolerate those increases of temperatures, they're either going to die out, or become extinct, or if their DNA gives just a little bit of an advantage in that they can withstand, some of them can withstand higher temperatures, they'll be able to then reproduce and pass their genes on to the next generation of coral, for example. All right, so yeah, genetic diversity is really important too. All right, so there is your biodiversity FRQ. I'm going to start doing this with our notes. There will be a question. FRQ stands for free response question about the content of the notes. And so this one is it, and I'd like you to push pause and write a response to this. It's also found on our Canvas page too. If there's any questions, let me know. We'll see you next time.